So you found a skeleton. How would you tell if it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. You might notice that I look a little different. That's because this video was a special request from one of my supporters, Space Dragon. So today, I'm a dragon in honor of that request. And no, I didn't make the dragon, I bought it for like $450 US. That's $4.50. Anyway, this video is a response to a video by UnWise of Answers in Genesis, who's going to stand in front of a computer monitor set up in the AIG lab for kids and tell us about the paleontology of Noah's flood. It's going to be exactly as accurate and intelligent as you're thinking. Let's see how far into the series we go before we have to question whether Wise is simply ignorant and incompetent or actually intentionally dishonest. Take it away, Kurt.
We're going to look at the paleontology of the flood. Paleontology is a science. However, with a science, we should start with Scripture.
Right out of the gate with one of the stupidest statements one can make. Reality came before the Bible. The Bible would not exist if reality were sufficiently different. Reality is prior to the Bible, and it is the standard by which it and your interpretations of it need to be tested. If reality, as judged on its own terms, tells you that the Bible is wrong, then either the Bible is wrong or your interpretation of it is wrong. I'm sorry if that contradicts your deeply held beliefs, but that's simply the only way to go about it that won't leave you with no reason to think you're right and to be almost certainly wrong. Science is not in the business of starting with conclusions. If you do that, you're doing pseudoscience. And if you're caught doing that while working on a degree, it is grounds for disciplinary action.
Yet when we look at Scripture, we find very little explicitly in the Bible about fossils and their formation.
By very little explicitly, he means nothing at all. The Bible doesn't talk about paleontology for two simple reasons. One, the people who wrote it had no understanding of the concept of fossils. And two, even if they did, they were writing their myths and their legendary history, polemics against their rivals and oppressors, and warnings to each other to remain faithful to their own beliefs and identity. Where in that is there time for someone to dig up a Spinosaurus or something?
We find a little bit about the flood in the Bible, a few chapters is devoted to it.
A few chapters that don't say anything about fossilization.
But there's little in that description that directly applies to fossils. We have reference to the breakup of the fountains of the great deep at the beginning of the flood.
Ah yes, the fountains in the ocean that God normally keeps plugged up like a bathtub drain, lest the infinite waters that surround the flat earth rush in, not needing to displace air, because the writers of the Bible didn't know that air was physical matter, that couldn't be infinitely compressed. I hope we hear about the floodgates of heaven, which are doors in the dome of the flat earth that let in the same waters, but from above.
We have the fountains of the great deep. We have the windows of heaven.
There it is.
We have the fact that the flood is a global flood over the entire earth. It's covering the mountains for at least part of that time, and it lasts for more than a year. It killed all the land animals and humans, but again, no explicit mention of paleontology.
In fact, among the land animals, the Bible says it killed the creeping things, which is primarily terrestrial invertebrates, which is odd since Answers in Genesis explicitly excludes them from riding on the ark, so kind of a big contradiction, and a lack of taking the Bible literally from these biblical literalists.
So we're going to have to learn about our flood paleontology from the fossils themselves.
What a concept, learning about the physical world by studying the things in it, rather than just assuming that your favorite interpretation of your favorite book is the absolute truth.
All the while keeping in mind, as we're studying them, that we can't forget the Bible. We've got to keep going back and checking to make sure that what we're postulating about fossils is in fact consistent with the biblical account.
And then he ruins it. There is no reason to go back and check the Bible. If you want to believe the Bible, you should go back after you've reached all your evidence-based conclusions, and then read what you find there in light of the much more certain physical evidence. If your intuitive interpretation of the Bible doesn't line up with reality, then it's the wrong interpretation, and if no interpretation you find reasonable lines up, then the Bible is wrong about that at least. Deal with it.
Our first question we might have is it possible that perhaps the fossils were created by God in the beginning?
Okay, I know young Earth creationists are bad at almost everything as a rule, but to be fair to them, they usually reject the old chestnut that God or Satan created the fossils to test your faith, so I fully expect Dr. Wise to reject this idea.
The problem is that some of the fossils are in fact animal fossils, and thus they are direct evidence of animal death.
I mean, I would have said the problem is that it allows an omnipotent divine liar in the door, which means you literally can't ever know anything about anything, because there's a very distinct possibility you're being flawlessly lied to by God. But okay, sure, let's go with that might make you think there was death before the fall.
In our understanding of Scripture, we have the introduction of nephesh death, or death of nephesh life, animals, only coming with the flood, with the fall.
Yes, in your understanding, which is not the only honest way to read the text, or the way most people read it. If you want to say there was no death before the fall, you're going to have to actually find evidence of that, not simply assume it at the outset, and then force all the data to fit into that narrative, and ignore the rest.
And it's then unlikely that God would have created in the original creation evidence of death in the original creation that wasn't going to be introduced into the world until after the fall.
I think we need a citation for that. But I love that even here, UnWise could go the smart route with fake fossils would mean there is no possibility for a coherent epistemology. Instead, he goes with, I don't think God would give a preview of the fall in the geology of the earth. Creationists, you're allowed to not give the worst take imaginable on all things. I know some of you know this, like Sal Cordova or Peter from Paleologos or Rebecca from Bread of Life, but most of them seem hell-bent on consistently using the worst arguments, even when better ones are right there and don't contradict young Earth creationism.
So I think we're forced to conclude, at least that when we're looking at the fossils of animals, that we have to be looking at a time after the creation.
If they were created, then no matter what's going on with the fall, it would have to be after the creation, since by definition, things can't be created before they're created. Maybe he just misspoke and meant after the fall. That would at least make sense internal to his logic.
So which fossils of those that were formed after the creation, the animal fossils, were formed in the flood? Or are any of them formed in the flood?
And now we need evidence of a flood. And the thing is, a global flood isn't the kind of thing you have to go argue about or scratch around in the rocks to try to find traces of evidence. It would be glaringly obvious across any part of the world that wasn't eroding rapidly. Flood deposits aren't subtle. They erase ichnofossils and bioturbation, they heavily grade bedding, they result in fossil assemblages that are jumbles of various ecosystems, etc. If there had been a massive global flood, there'd be a gigantic deposit with those characteristics everywhere on Earth where it hadn't been removed by erosion. It would be far more obvious than the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary at the end of the age of the dinosaurs. Instead, it just doesn't exist, and Wise, along with his colleagues like Snelling and Austin, just pretend that the rocks of the Mesozoic and Paleozoic, which in their geology are no different from the rocks under or above them, are flood rocks, for literally no reason other than that they say that some of the rocks are flood rocks. And since those have a lot of fossils, and the flood would have produced fossils, those are a convenient group of rocks for them.
Let's look at the major features of Earth's fossils to answer that particular question. We look at the biostratigraphic column. That is a...
At this point, he launches into a very slow and boring description of the term biostratigraphic column. I'll do it faster and while wearing a top hat. It's a chart showing the various layers or strata of the Earth's rock with the organisms found in those noted on the chart, especially index fossils, which are used to indicate where in the column particular fossil-bearing rocks are from.
In the lower part of the biostratigraphic column, even in some places tens of thousands of feet, we have rocks, but we do not have animal fossils. In fact, we don't have plant fossils. We don't have any fossils of any macroorganisms at all. The only fossils we find in this lowest portion of the fossil record are bacteria.
Remember how floods characteristically wash multiple ecosystems together into the same deposit? Well, they also tend to sort fossils by side, so if there's a flood deposit, the bacteria should be at the top, not the bottom. And this is just basic hydrodynamics. Small things stay suspended in the water column longer, because forces like bulk fluid flow and Brownian motion are more likely to overcome gravity if the particulate in question is light.
This is the most of the Precambrian, with the exception of the very uppermost Precambrian, which has got a few more organisms in it. There are no animals for most of the Precambrian.
True, which is kind of a problem since those rocks include, as admitted by Wise himself, sedimentary deposits with fossils. That means the whole communities of bacteria had time to grow, die, be buried by sediments, and for those sediments to lithify, all in evidently normal conditions and all before the flood, and all without a single plant dropping a leaf or some pollen. This seems, well, far-fetched doesn't really cover it. How about off the walls, bonkers, insane? Still a bit mild for this idea, but oh well, my words have failed me.
Above that point, once we start getting especially animal fossils, we have a biostratigraphic column that has been built from primarily marine organisms. Most of the fossils on the planet are in fact of marine, shallow marine organisms, as a matter of fact.
Yep. In the past as now, shallow marine environments are reasonably stable, unlike deep marine environments which tend to be subducted. Also, the shallow seawater is where the largest extent of deposition occurs, as sediment is washed in from across continents by river systems.
Relatively few are in fact land animals or plants, that sort of thing. So this is primarily based upon the most abundant fossils, which would be marine organisms.
Which tend not to be found in a single flood deposit. Weird, isn't it?
From that biostratigraphic column, we've been able to divide the organisms up into different faunas. For example, there are 3 major marine megafaunas.
Okay, this isn't really a thing that gets to the main point he's talking about, but it's one of those things where it gives an indication he has no clue what he's talking about. Megafauna isn't a term he should be using here. Megafauna are large terrestrial animals like elephants or rhinos and such. It's not a word you can make plural. It already has the form of a plural noun. The singular word would be megafaunas, if such a word existed, but it doesn't, and instead, the word is a non-count noun, like milk. It makes just as much grammatical sense to say you have 3 megafaunas as it does to say you drank 3 milks for breakfast. Answers in Genesis is trying to overturn more or less all science, and when you're doing something like that, you need to be as careful as possible to be on point. Sloppiness like this is not becoming of a scientific rebel. Now, of course, Wise has already explicitly admitted he's not doing science because he has a conclusion in mind and won't be swayed by evidence, but he still wants to seem like he's doing science, so he shouldn't make these kinds of mistakes. What he should have said was faunal assemblages. A faunal assemblage is the animals that are present in a given place at a given stratum. And really, there are far more than 3, but whatever.
There is one in the lower part of the biostratigraphic column called the Cambrian megafauna.
Faunal assemblage, but no, there are many faunal assemblages in the Cambrian because it's made up of multiple strata, both vertically and horizontally.
And then there's one above it called the Paleozoic.
Same thing. There are many.
Megafauna. And then there is finally one marine megafauna that goes from the top of the Paleozoic all the way to the present, which has been entitled the modern marine megafauna.
I guess the whole Mesozoic is just like right now? That's why when you swim in the ocean, you have to watch out for mosasaur attacks, and why ammonite is such a popular sushi item.
If you look at the terrestrial world, the terrestrial fossils, the fossils of land animals and plants and aquatic animals, things that live on the land.
Ah yes, the aquatic animals that live on the land. Of course. I honestly don't know how I'm supposed to take this man seriously. People misspeak, but when misspeaking is your default, maybe you just don't know what you're talking about.
We find basically 3 megafaunas and floras in the terrestrial world.
Megaflora is the same thing as megafauna, except it's for plants. It's a non-count noun referring to exceptionally large plant species.
There is a primary, a Paleozoic fauna, if you wish. It doesn't go as far down as the Paleozoic fauna of the marine world.
Which is weird since floods jumble organisms, so really there should be no identifiable assemblage beyond just the flood assemblage. Especially since the flood, being a single event, would deposit a single stratum, given that that's what a stratum is, the rocks deposited by a particular depositional environment, however long that lasts and however geographically extensive it is.
But nonetheless ends at about the same point in the stratigraphic column. There is a secondary land fauna flora that corresponds to, is in between the Paleozoic and the modern, and then there is a modern fauna. If we look at that modern fauna, the rocks that represent that modern fauna, we also have in that particular zone increasingly modern fossils.
Oh, the kind of thing you'd expect if evolution were true? Neato.
As a matter of fact, again, referring to marine organisms, they subdivided this upper portion of the column according to how many of the fossils we find in that rock are in fact modern.
I should have asked this before, but what do we mean by modern here? In the historical sense, that's from about the 16th century onward. In art history, it's a period in the 19th and 20th centuries. Do we mean percentage of organisms that were found in the year 1500? Is it percentage of species that are still extant? Is it just eyeballing a thing and, like, maybe an extinct deer like Megaloceros looks enough like a modern deer to count? I don't know, and I doubt Kurt does either.
It's percent modern species. At the very base, we have rocks with no modern species at all. As we go up the Cenozoic, we have increasing percentage of modern species.
So, do no modern species exist before the flood? I honestly don't know if that's what the implication is.
Also, when we expand this and look more closely at it, we find that species are found from a certain depth up to a certain point. It's called the stratigraphic range of a given organism. We have overlapping stratigraphic ranges. We have organisms that seem to begin at one point in another, and another organism is overlapping with it. There's no clear place where we can make a boundary.
That's true for literally the whole column, including whatever Wise wants to put in the flood boundary. If he tries to say otherwise, trust me, I'll show he's wrong.
Between some event before, some event after. So this seems to be a continuous sequence. That, combined with the percent living species, suggests that we have no breaks in here from any, no significant breaks in sedimentation and fossilization.
There was no significant erosion in the Cenozoic. The Grand Canyon? Never heard of it. Scablands? What are those? But presumably he means not below the Cenozoic.
And then when you look within families in this same zone, we find that there are many families that show a sequence of fossils all the way up, and in fact a series of very logical family lineages.
So I guess the sequence of animals like Psittacosaurus, Archaeoceratops, Leptoceratops, Protoceratops, Zuniceratops, and Triceratops just doesn't exist in the rocks. Nope, not real. That definitely doesn't show the development of things like horns and a frill, or increasingly graviportal limbs, or the increasing prominence of the premaxilla as a unique bone in this group of animals.
One species not only overlapping with the next, but in fact logically transitioning from that species. There's no direct transitions, but it looks like you could line those up. It looks like those species really could have transitioned one to another.
Well, you heard it here first. According to AIG's own Kurt Wise, a transitional species doesn't actually have to be the direct ancestor of a later species to count. And they are indeed good evidence for evolutionary relationships. So I guess all of these count as evidence for evolution, according to AIG. An example here from the frog family, but there's many other examples that we have. Like the mammalian Cogyonid family that nicely spreads across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. Heck, among them, the members of genus Hyena managed to get from the Cretaceous to the Paleogene. I guess they missed the memo that they were supposed to die in the flood.
In this column, what this suggests is that this upper portion of the column, which is often called the Cenozoic, is in fact after the flood. It is the modern world.
Except, we have organisms spanning that gap, doing the same evolving below as above it. Granted, fewer of them across that particular boundary, but that's because of a gigantic space rock that slammed into Mexico. But also, as I've pointed out, we have the same kind of evolutionary sequences that Kurt says are okay in the Cenozoic in other time periods. Now granted, they're easier to find in the Cenozoic, but that's basically because by virtue of being younger, less of it has been destroyed and is higher up. So overall, we'd expect the fossil record of the Cenozoic to be better than that of the Mesozoic or the Paleozoic.
It's in between the Cenozoic and the Precambrian, then, that we most logically will put the fossils of the flood.
No.
Yeah, maybe if we didn't have organisms spanning that alleged barrier, that might work. Sad fact is, we do. And of course, the Paleozoic and Mesozoic aren't made up of a big flood deposit. They're made up of many deposits, including lacustrine, fluvial, marine, and even aeolian, that's formed under a lake, a river, the ocean, and the air, in order for those who might not be geology nerds.
In that zone, then, between the upper Precambrian and the base of the Cenozoic, we have billions and billions of fossils.
Oh, it's far worse. Even though creationists agree with scientists that most animals don't get fossilized, the number of fossil individuals is too high for them all to have existed in a single year. Literally, the Earth would have been covered in a sludge of algae, mollusks, insects, and not a few larger examples of macrofauna, in the correct sense. Here's a link to Dr. Joel Duff going on a deep dive about how just one group of Mesozoic cephalopods left too many fossil shells to have all lived together at the same time without filling the oceans of the world in a carpet of tentacly boys. Also, go subscribe to him. The fact that at the time of me writing this, he's not able to monetize is something we can and should fix.
There's billions of organisms that were in fact buried in the flood. As a matter of fact, if you look at the fossil record of the flood, you find all sorts of organisms in the fossil record that you do not find in the living world.
I guess God had a pretty low success rate with the ark, huh?
There's a long list of these. There's 57 classes that we have in the fossil record, but we don't have in the present world. We have 231 orders in the fossil record that we don't have in the present world. And there's even larger number of families and genera and species.
Including huge numbers that never showed up in the Cenozoic, despite being on the ark according to answers in Genesis. And by the way, I assume that anyone working for that group agrees with their official stances unless they say otherwise. If you work for an ideological organization, it's reasonable to assume you agree with them until shown otherwise.
So we're looking at not only lots of fossils, but fossils of a world that was far more diverse than the present world.
Ooh, question begging. Yay! In order to say that the world was more diverse in the past in terms of biology, and then use basically all pre-Cenozoic fossils as a collection to demonstrate that, you have to show that they all existed at the same time. But guess what? That's what he needs to demonstrate, that they all lived at the same time. You can't assume that his conclusion about biblical history is true and then use that assumption to show it's true. That's a logical fallacy.
So the flood seems to have decimated life. By decimated, I mean it had a certain diversity before the flood, and it significantly narrowed that diversity in the course of the flood.
Nope, still just begging the question.
This suggests that the flood was, in fact, a catastrophe.
You don't need to suggest it. If there was a global flood, it was definitely a catastrophe. But assuming there was one, then interpreting all data to fit that doesn't actually demonstrate that such a flood existed.
It was a very unusual event that very rapidly destroyed a significant number of organisms, both on the land and on the sea.
I'm just waiting for all the evidence that all Mesozoic and Paleozoic strata were deposited in a single global flood. Weird how that's not forthcoming, and instead many formations are explained by low energy deposition, like the Solnhofen limestone that deposited the matrix around Archaeopteryx, or the formation where the bugs that AIG's pet paleontologist Dr. Haynes described for her own dissertation were found. So let's be real, even the young Earth creationists know that that's nonsense.
Another characteristic of the fossils in this zone of what we're ascribing to the flood is that they're common and well preserved. There are many fossils.
Yeah, except that a violent flood carrying huge amounts of often extremely large and coarse sediments aren't really good at preserving exquisite detail. Again, as noted by Dr. Haynes in her dissertation. You know, AIG's pet paleontologist. The fine detail she was able to see in her fossil wasps was thanks to the low energy deposition that didn't mechanically destroy the wings, which is what she says in her own dissertation.
This is kind of an unusual characteristic because in the present world, it's not an easy thing to, in fact, it's not often that you can find fossils.
I'm really going to need a citation on that. But of course, also by definition, if it's not more than 10,000 years old, it's not a fossil. So yeah, you can't find a fossil from 3 years ago because then it wouldn't be a fossil, it would just be remains.
It's not easy to produce fossils.
It never has been.
If we played a little game and asked ourselves, if you wanted to be a fossil, if you were a little critter that wanted to be a fossil, what would it take to get yourself fossilized? It would be quite a process, actually.
I mean, not if I live in the right place, die somewhere where I fall into a bit of water that has deposition faster than my hard bits decay. That's not most places, but it's also not no places.
You might be, if you're, again, the most common kind of fossil is a marine invertebrate fossil, so you're swimming around in the shallow marine zone, maybe you're a cephalopod or something like that. What do you have to do, or what has to happen for you to get preserved as a fossil?
Die, then a small landslide. Boom, fossilized.
First thing is you've got to avoid the carnivores, those that are out to eat you.
Not many of those under a landslide, so check.
Because most of the time the carnivores, when they consume you, will in fact crunch you up and you won't be able to be preserved as a fossil because there won't be much left of you.
Fun fact, a coprolite is fossil dung, and in the case of dung from predators, it can contain identifiable animal remains. So even if you are eaten, it's not a guarantee that you won't be fossilized.
And then, so maybe during your life you can keep away from the carnivores, but once you die, of course, you can no longer have any choice in the matter.
Well, like I said, that isn't always a problem for fossilization, but since I'm under a landslide anyway, the problem that wasn't really a problem is already solved.
But you have to avoid another problem at that point. You have to avoid the scavengers. In the modern world, scavengers are very effective at destroying the bodies of dead organisms, both on the land and in the sea, maybe even more especially in the sea.
Good thing that all the ones that are good at quickly eating carrion are already either buried with me in the landslide or are less likely to find me under all this sediment anyway. It's now mostly up to the anaerobic bacteria, and they are very slow.
The fact is that God created organisms in such a way that there's a whole group of organisms. Their job is to eat up, consume the organisms that die or parts of organisms that die so that we don't end up in a pile of dead bodies.
So, what were they eating before the fall when there was no death? And you can't just say something else, because they were designed to be scavengers, according to UnWise.
So scavengers, the decomposers of the environment, are usually very effective at destroying bodies.
Sure, when they have easy access to the bodies, they don't in all cases. But also, there are scavenge marks on fossils all the time, so even scavenging isn't a deal breaker. And also remember, you can be completely scavenged by a large predator and then get pooped out and preserved anyway.
For an organism to end up being fossilized, you've got to get away from the scavengers.
It helps, but it's not necessary.
And probably one of the best ways to do that is to get buried or covered so that the scavengers can't see you.
Oh hey, that's already taken care of. Neat.
But there's another problem you have to encounter, which is the problem of the aerobic decomposers.
Fun fact, anoxic conditions exist, especially under sufficient sediment. So again, if the sedimentation rate is high enough, or just oxygen is low enough, no problem.
There are those that are running around on the surface looking for dead bodies that are sitting on the surface, and especially in the marine realm, there are organisms then that dig into the mud at the bottom of the ocean, at the bottom of even especially the shallow marine portion of the ocean, and they're continually churning it up, finding dead organisms at depth. They will in fact decompose them.
I feel like I keep stealing his thunder. Sorry about that.
I referred to them as the aerobic decomposers because they dig into the mud and circulate ocean water down into their burrows. They're bringing oxygen into those places. These organisms require oxygen in order to do their decomposition. Because of that, because they have access to oxygen, their decomposition is actually usually very efficient and very effective. And so this is a zone that's it's very difficult to survive through. Again, if you want to be a fossil, you're going to be destroyed almost certainly if you end up in this zone.
Good thing that zone is escapable by means that aren't just global flood.
So how do you get out of this zone? How do you get into a position where you can be fossilized? Best way would be to be buried far enough or deep enough that you're not only out of sight of the scavengers, but you're below the depth of oxygen for the aerobic decomposers.
Like a normal old slump of marine muck, the kind of thing that happens all the time.
Problem is aerobic decomposers usually can burrow down scores of feet. In a very quick time can get several feet down. So you've got to be buried pretty fast in order to get out of this aerobic decomposition zone.
Of course, if the locals were themselves killed in this slump, that's a nice little reprieve.
And very few organisms, certainly in the present world, end up being able to get through that zone, buried deep enough, soon enough, that they can be preserved as fossils. But even when you get to that point, you've got another problem. You've got a problem with the anaerobic decomposers. There are bacteria that don't require oxygen that continue the process of decomposition.
Already covered it. They're very slow, and they're equally a problem for the flood model as for real science. We're skipping that since anything he says is just an argument against himself, and arguing against him is my job.
Let's say you do get buried deep enough, fast enough, that you can get out of the scavengers and the aerobic decomposers, and maybe even keep ahead of the anaerobic decomposers. Once you've been made into a fossil, you've still got to avoid the process of erosion that brings your fossil back up, brings you as a fossil back up to the surface.
Once again, also a problem for the flood if it's a problem for geology. This is a wash. See what I did there?
The point is that in the present world, fossilization is a rare process. It's very hard to reproduce the conditions that make fossilization optimal.
Cool, but Madagascar is full of lemurs that are fossilizing right now. Lake Natron is full of all sorts of fossilizing animals. Fossilization happens now.
As a consequence, you wouldn't expect the commonness of fossils that we see in the fossil record, and certainly the fact that they're extremely well preserved.
Why not? The fact that most organisms won't fossilize doesn't tell us anything on its own about how many fossils we should find. This is only a problem for old ages of the Earth if we already assume a flood, which we can't because besides it already having been shown not to have happened, we haven't even begun to argue that it has. If the flood were already well evidenced, and the young age of the Earth were already well evidenced, then sure, you could argue that the abundance of fossils are a problem. But as it is, they're actually a problem for the flood, because there are far too many of them to have all been alive at one time on one planet. But if they had lived over the course of millions of years, that's a perfectly reasonable amount of time for all those fossils to exist. And I really want to drive this home. There are more fossils on Earth than living things. And by a lot.
What this suggests is that there's a rapid burial that's occurring during the flood that is not occurring in the present world, or not commonly occurring in the present world.
So then why are most fossils not found in sediment that can even be flood deposits? I mean, famously, the fighting dinosaurs are in Aeolian sandstone. They died in a sandy desert with no water to be seen. The Coconino sandstone preserves raindrops, something impossible deep under the flood, which is where it would have had to have been deposited in flood geology.
Which, combined with this evidence of catastrophe, suggests we have a catastrophe of very rapid burial during the flood.
Except, no, it suggests that there have been various catastrophes at various times, because the catastrophe-type deposits are interspersed with a sedimentary column that is primarily non-catastrophic in origin. There has yet to be any confirmed way to say deposit fine-grained non-flocculated shale in a flood. Yet the Bright Angel Shale, which is a Cambrian stratum, so it was apparently laid down in a flood, is made of fine-grained non-flocculated shale.
Another observation that we deduce from the fossils is that the fossils have been transported a very long ways, and that they've been transported along lines of latitude.
Sometimes, other times, we have fossilized root traces in fossilized soil that can't have been transported or the root traces would have been erased. And yet, there they are. In fact, that was found offshore in Norway, along with Norway's only dinosaur, a plateosaurid that may have actually been Plateosaurus, as reported by Johan Nystuen in his 2022 paper, A Late Triassic Dinosaur Bone, Offshore Norway. To be entirely honest, I'm telling you about this because it's a cool paper. It's linked in the description. Go read it when you're done with this video.
This is, it's not always possible to deduce this, but in some cases it's pretty clear that this is what's happening.
Yeah, like when young Earth creationist Summer Rose Weeks found that a graded bone bed was deposited in a flood in the Lance Formation. Of course, she also determined that the dinosaurs had to have died, laid out rotting for a long while, before a subsequent flood washed the bones into a low-lying area, so, not a global flood. Which is too bad, since I don't know how she, or Arthur Chadwick, fellow young Earth creationist who was her professor, and signed off on her paper, squared this with their flood geology.
You have a fossil, let's say, you have a coral fossil that is preserved in what was originally a carbonate mud. Well, that's a problem because corals have to grow on solid surfaces. If they're sitting in mud, they sink into the mud and it kills them. So the fact that this coral is now deposited or found in what was originally mud must mean that it was carried from some other place to that location. That's not where it lived. So what you do is you follow the rock along to find out where you got evidence of a hard surface. And you often have to trace these rocks for hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands of miles, before you ever encounter any reasonable place that such a fossil could come from. These kinds of inferences suggest over and over again that organisms in this flood fossil zone have been carried huge distances to be buried where they are.
Sure would have been nice if we had some examples to look at, but yeah, fossils can be carried along in both catastrophic and non-catastrophic processes. I don't know if Kurt knows this, but sometimes things fall into flowing water, and yes, sometimes there are catastrophes, but again, evidence that a catastrophe happened isn't then evidence specifically of a global flood. That catastrophes have happened isn't an issue. The question isn't how do young Earth creationists explain flood deposits, it's how do they explain non-flood deposits without lying about them? And the answer is basically, well, that they don't.
They've been buried rapidly, but they've also been carried a long ways before they were buried. And when you start putting all the pieces together and do this for a number of different organisms, you notice that when they're buried in the same kind of latitude you might expect them to have lived in.
Like all those tropical plants and animals in the fossil record of Antarctica. Yeah, sure.
For example, with coral. Coral in the present world is restricted to within about 30 degrees north and south of the equator because they require rather warm temperature in the water. They would like a situation where calcium carbonate is in the water and ready to precipitate out, easy for the organisms to take out calcium carbonate and deposit shell material, coral material with it from that material.
So speaking of coral, this is El Capitan. A large portion of the mountain is made of the skeletons of coral. Now coral can't grow all that fast, and this represents hundreds of feet of coral. And it's in situ. It's where it grew. So how did this coral reef grow so big before the flood and then survive getting blasted by mega tsunamis and hypercanes and such? I don't think they'll really try to explain it. I've checked, and the only thing I found in the creationist literature was about the granite of the mountain, not the coral. So I don't know. Now, I'm not going to spend all my time checking, so if you know of a paper that they have written, or a video they've done, or even a blog post about El Capitan's coral, let me know. I would love to hear the explanation they give. But anyway, that's where we're going to pause it. Next time, we're going to start getting into things like paleocurrents, and I want that to be all in one video, so right now we're cutting this video here. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, let me know in the comments what you liked about it, and hit that like button. If you didn't like it, then hey, hit the dislike button and tell me what you didn't like in the comments. Either way, please subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon and turn on all notifications so that way you're always notified when I have more content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Bent Hovend, Cynically Skeptic, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Patrick Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out.